Hi, welcome to Exam AZ-900 Microsoft Azure Fundamental Study Guide. This is episode 13 of 63, Azure Database Products. My name's Tim Warner. Where we are in the AZ-900 objective domain is the functional group Understand Core Azure Services. Specifically, we're working through the objective Describe some of the core products available in Azure. And today we're concerned even more specifically with the data platform. We have to understand and differentiate the basics of Cosmos DB, Azure SQL Database, Azure Database Migration Service, and Azure SQL Data Warehouse. That last bit is a little bit interesting, and I'll have more to say about what Data Warehouse is now in just a moment. Historically, the Azure SQL Database was the first product in Microsoft Azure, or as it was originally known, Windows Azure. So it's a really mature product. And as you can see here, we've got on the left Azure SQL Database, of which there are a few different varieties. And then on the right, we have something called Azure Synapse or Azure Synapse Analytics. Let's take this one piece at a time. First of all, Azure SQL Database is the cloud-hosted, managed platform-as-a-service SQL Server database. SQL Server has long been Microsoft's flagship relational database management system, and we have nowadays in 2020 a high degree of feature parity between SQL Server running on-premises and Azure SQL Database running in the cloud. Azure SQL Database is used principally for application back-end in an online transaction processing paradigm, OLTP databases. In other words, you expect to be reading from the database and writing to it fairly regularly. A key architectural component behind all of the Azure Data Platform products, but particularly Azure SQL Database, is that you shouldn't have to learn a separate set of tools. You can still continue to use your existing tools. It's just that the database is being hosted in the Azure cloud and therefore has massive scaling and high availability possibilities. So we want to think of vertical scale. Remember that from earlier in this course, where if your database isn't performing to your satisfaction, you can, with a couple mouse clicks or a line of Azure CLI, Azure PowerShell, resize the virtual server underneath the database and immediately see a performance benefit. We also have turnkey geo-replication. The idea of taking a SQL Server database that runs in your local data center and placing replicas of it around the world, think of how expensive and time-consuming that is in a local data center environment. As I'll show you in the demo, it's just a couple mouse clicks to geo-distribute and then have failover disaster recovery protection for your Azure SQL databases. Also, we have Microsoft's Advanced Threat Analytics engine, where Azure is constantly scanning your database and its access patterns and warning you of potential threats. Really great benefits here. Now, Azure Synapse or Azure Synapse Analytics is a product that was formerly known as Azure SQL Data Warehouse. I have a friend who actually has worked on the data warehouse team for many years, and she told me herself she was as befuddled by that name change as anybody else. I don't understand why Microsoft at the Ignite 2019 conference would change a very long-standing brand name to something totally different. But really what we've got here is two things. Azure Synapse Analytics is for online analytical processing, or OLAPs. So your data pattern with Synapse Analytics is fundamentally different from Azure SQL Database. With analytics, you've got massive horizontal scale. Without having to set up a physical server cluster, you can let Azure take care of horizontally scaling out the underlying compute, and this allows you to do large-scale data analytics. Actually, there's two main feature points of Azure Synapse. There's data warehousing. That's a tech buzzword that means that your data is already defined. You already know what its purpose is. It's just that you need a platform for reporting and analysis. And the other thing that Synapse gives you is big data analytics using traditional big data platforms. Like if you've ever heard of Apache Hadoop or Databricks and those platforms, we've got lots of integration there with Azure Synapse Analytics. Next, we have Cosmos DB. This product was originally called Document DB. It's a globally distributed multi-model non-relational database, whereas Azure SQL Database and Synapse Analytics are both strongly in the relational data model. Cosmos serves the need for application developers who need a NoSQL or non-relational data store. And some benefits here is that you've got turnkey global distribution, as you can see on the picture on the right-hand side of this slide. So that's going to give your data a very high degree of availability. There's 5 different data consistency models, from strong to eventual. Again, it depends upon how important it is that updates get reflected to all of your replicas around the world. And as you can see at the bottom of this diagram, there are a number of data models or APIs that you can choose from that correspond to different common non-relational data models: key value, column, document, and graph in particular. I'm a big fan of Cosmos DB. It's really cool. It's one non-relational database management system to rule them all. The idea is that you can create a Cosmos account to serve just about any existing NoSQL need with your application, and the documentation for Cosmos is also very rich. Lastly, we have the Azure Database Migration Service, also called DMS in the Azure literature. This is part of the Azure Migrate product. Azure Migrate is intended to be a one-stop shop for just about any kind of migration into Azure. We're talking about from data to your virtual machines and physical servers to different databases, and that's what this exam objective and this particular skill is touching on. Azure Database Migration Service gives you online or offline database migration at scale, which means that it can orchestrate several database migrations at once. Now, the source for those databases could be on-premises running in your data centers, but it also could be migration from another cloud like Google Cloud Platform or Amazon Web Services. Notice also that Database Migration Service goes far beyond the Microsoft product family. Yes, you have first-class support for SQL Server, but there's also first-class support for migrating AWS, the Amazon Web Service RDS for the SQL and the PostgreSQL models. There's native PostgreSQL database migration support, MySQL, Oracle, and MongoDB. So once again, Microsoft is embracing customers and their data where the customers and the data live, and giving them a first-class experience in migration to the Azure cloud. In this brief demonstration, I'm going to show you some of the major aspects of Azure SQL Database, just so you can kick the tires a little bit. I'm logged into the Azure portal as an administrator, and I'll do a search for SQL Server and click the SQL Databases service. As you can see here, I have 2 instances of the same AdventureWorks sample database. Now notice that the replication role and server are different. This speaks to what I had mentioned earlier, the fact that Azure SQL Database allows you to geo-replicate your database in a turnkey way. It's so important and so powerful. Notice that the pricing tier has a collection of families and levels, just like we saw earlier in the course when we looked at virtual machines in Azure. Let's drill into my primary database, and I'll show you some of the things that jump out. If I scroll down under Settings, we can come to Geo-Replication, and this is where I configured it. All I had to do was literally click the map, or if you scroll down below, choose an appropriate target region, and then set up another virtual server that's running in that region, and you're good to go. Go to connection strings to get the data that your developers will need to plug your application into this database. Uses all the standard connection string protocols, as you can see here: ADO.NET, JDBC, ODBC, PHP, and Go. Another thing, if we come down under Security, Advanced Data Security, this gets into the Advanced Threat Analytics that I was mentioning earlier. Let me collapse this panel. Specifically, the Advanced Data Security product will look at your data, and as you can see here under Data Discovery and Classification, and give you recommendations on what you might need to do to that data. For instance, classifying, putting labels on certain columns to stay in compliance with well-known compliance regulations like GDPR. We can see in Vulnerability Assessment that we can scan or just let Azure periodically look at our database for security vulnerabilities and give us recommendations on how we can remediate those. And then lastly, we can take a look at Advanced Threat Protection, where any security alerts will show up. This is a new database, so I wouldn't expect to see anything yet at this point, but this is going to give you a heads up if for instance, a malicious person is attempting some kind of attack on your database. You definitely want to know about that sooner rather than later. Lastly, let me show you how easy it is to connect to an Azure SQL database using your existing toolset. If I come up to the very top of the settings and go back to Overview, we can see the DNS name for the virtual server on which this AWorks database runs. I'm going to put this DNS name into my clipboard, as you can see here, and fire up SQL Server Management Studio. This is the typical Windows desktop application that SQL Server administrators and developers tend to use. I'll open the Connect menu and make a connection to the database engine. For the server name, I'll paste in the DNS name of the virtual server. I'm going to do a SQL Server authentication and put in my login and my password, and then we'll connect. A little bit different behavior when you're running in the cloud. Of course, your Azure SQL database isn't going to be publicly accessible to anonymous connections, so you have the idea of the firewall and explicitly allowing, using Azure Resource Manager role-based access control, access to the database. So I'm going to have to authenticate into Azure and pass a role-based access control check before I'll be allowed to connect to the database. This makes sense, at least it does to me. I hope it does to you as well. I've got multi-factor authentication, so I just answered that push notification on my phone. And here we're creating a firewall rule for my client IP address to allow me to complete this. And the only reason I'm being taken in is because I passed the RBAC authorization check. So now I can come into those databases and run queries just like I would in any other circumstance. I'll take a look at my customers, for instance. I'll select the top 1,000 rows, and we're in business. Now, if you are an existing SQL Server DBA or developer, be aware that you do make some concessions with Azure SQL Database. For example, if we right-click the virtual server, notice that there's not a properties option. This is a platform product. Do know, though, that, and I'd encourage you to check the docs about this, there's another product called Azure SQL Database Managed Instance that does give you more control over the underlying virtual server. And in a pinch, you can always run SQL Server natively on a virtual machine. SQL Server and SQL databases nowadays work on both Windows and Linux. For learning resources, check out this article called Choose the Right Azure SQL Deployment Option. It's a really nice architecture diagram that gives you the lay of the land in terms of questions you and your team should ask yourself as you're planning a data platform migration to Azure. That's timw.info/ADO. And then perform an online SQL Server migration with DMS. That's at timw.info/ADMS. Now, of course, the AZ-900 Microsoft Azure Fundamentals is not a technical certification as such. You're not going to have performance-based labs like you will with the associate and expert ones. But if you are an IT professional, I just wanted to give you these resources if you want to broaden and deepen your knowledge. For non-relational data in a Microsoft Azure context, lastly, check out timw.info/NRD. Thanks so much for your participation. I look forward to seeing you in the next module. I'm at Twitter at TechTrainerTim. My Pluralsight library is timw.info/PS, and my website is techtrainertim.com. Take care.